Hello, I'm Dr. Paul Anthony White, and this is the second video in my Introduction to International Relations series. So in this video, I want to start to look at a few core concepts that are quite foundational to the study of international relations. So some of these concepts, we'll talk first of all about the Westphalian state system and the principle of sovereignty. We'll then go on to talk about the concept of anarchy. We'll talk a little bit about security and a little bit about globalization as well. So let's start off by looking at the concept of the nation state and the principle of state sovereignty. So first of all, it's important to try to get the terminology right. You know, we hear the terms country and nation and state, and often we tend to use those terms almost interchangeably, as though they meant the same thing. But they are not actually quite synonymous. They mean slightly different things. So a country basically is a rather vague term, which means a geographical place. It means a place on a map, essentially. A nation is a group of people who have a shared national identity. A state is a legal entity that possesses sovereignty. So, is Wales a country? Is Scotland a country? Well, yes, you know, they are places on the map. You know, there's a place called Wales, you can find it on the map. Is there a Welsh nation? Is there a Scottish nation? Yes, there is a Welsh national identity, there is a Scottish national identity. However, neither Wales nor Scotland, at the present moment anyway, are sovereign states because they are part of the larger sovereign state, which is the United Kingdom. So states have fixed territories with mutually exclusive borders, and one state's border implies another's. In other words, where one state's territory stops, another state's territory begins. There is no overlap. You know, so for example, you can stand on the French-German border, and you step over that border, and you leave France and you enter Germany. You can't be simultaneously in France and Germany. Well, I suppose you could if you had one foot at one side of the border and one foot at the other. But you know, France ends here, Germany starts here. There is no overlap. So mutually exclusive borders. And within those borders, states possess legal sovereignty. So let's talk first of all about the institutions that make up a state, and then let's talk a little bit more about this concept of sovereignty. So again, the modern state, if we think of what is a state, we would think of the state institutions. So states are built around various institutions. So a state is going to have some form of executive, a government. It's going to have some form of legislature, which creates laws. It's going to have a judiciary, which interprets the law and applies the law. It's going to have a bureaucracy. Every state has some kind of bureaucracy or civil service. In the present day, highly complex ones. States usually have armed forces. There are a very small number of states which don't possess armed forces as such, but almost every state possesses armed forces. States usually possess police. Modern states also usually provide public services, so it may be, depending on the state, it may be the function of the state to provide, for example, healthcare or education. But the state, when we think of the state, we tend to think of the institutions that the state is built around. Ultimately, underpinning all of that at a deeper, more fundamental level is this principle of sovereignty, this principle of sovereign authority. So what is sovereignty? We can think of sovereignty as being final authority over a given territory. The last word in authority, basically. So first of all, the state has universal authority. The state has authority over absolutely all affairs. The state can pass legislation, for example, regulating anything that it wants to. There is nothing outside the jurisdiction of the state. The state has supreme authority. There is no higher power than the state. The state is the top level authority, and the state has exclusive authority. There are no alternative sources of authority, or at least not at the level of the state. There are no other exclusive sources of sovereign authority. Now, of course, there are other types of authority within a state. So if you have a job and your boss has authority over you within the company structure. However, your boss's authority is not on the same level as the state's authority. So if, for example, the state passes legislation around workers' rights and dictates that your employer has to pay you more or has to abide by some conditions, for example, working hours conditions, your employer has no choice but to do what the state has legislated. So while there are other types of authority, none of these authorities, or all of these other authorities, are subordinate to the authority of the state. And sovereignty is sometimes defined in terms of a monopoly on the legitimate use of force. Again, states usually have armed forces. States usually have police forces who are authorised to wield force on behalf of the state. So ultimately, if you don't obey the state has the capacity and legally has the authority to force you to obey. So again, force in practice, of course, may be used by others besides the state, but that is not considered to be legitimate. So if, for example, the local gang, the local drug gang, comes and kicks your door down and beats you up, that's a use of force, but it's an illegitimate use of force. It is not a lawful use of force. On the other hand, if the police come and kick your door down and drag you away and lock you up, that is deemed to be legitimate, provided they have followed the law. They have acted in accordance with the law. You might not feel that it's legitimate, but in legal terms, it is legitimate. It's legitimate use of force because it is authorised by the state. So sovereignty is sometimes defined in terms of a monopoly on the legitimate use of force. Now, you'll often hear this system described as the Westphalian state system. And so it's important to have at least an outline understanding of what that means. So the concept of territorial sovereignty, as we understand it in international law today, originated with the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. The Treaty of Westphalia ended the 30 Years' War in Europe, which was a very bloody conflict based on religious warfare, essentially. The conflict between Protestant and Catholic monarchs, which came out of the schism in the Christian Church. So prior to this treaty, a lot of the cause of the conflict in Europe was that the Catholic and Protestant monarchs saw it as their right and indeed as their duty to intervene in the territory of other monarchs in order to uphold their religion. So, if I'm a Catholic king and my neighbouring king is Protestant, I might feel obliged to intervene in his territory in order to uphold the rights of the Catholics living there and maybe even to convert that territory into a Catholic territory by overthrowing the existing Protestant ruler. So, of course, this was a recipe for warfare, and that's what happened. Indeed, the 30 Years' War saw more casualties relative to the population size at the time than the First World War. So the Treaty of Westphalia which finally put an end to this, was based essentially on the agreement that, okay, I'm a Catholic king, you're a Protestant king, I won't interfere within your borders, and you won't interfere within my borders. We won't interfere in each other's internal affairs. And this was the basis for the principle of sovereignty. And this principle was later exported to the rest of the world, largely as a result of European colonialism. And so today, this Westphalian state system is the basis for political organisation across the globe. So it's important to remember, therefore, that the state, the modern Westphalian state, based on the principle of sovereignty, hasn't always existed, at least not in the form that we know it today. Yes, prior to that, there were other forms of what we might call proto-states. You know, you had kingdoms, you had the medieval sort of kingdoms of Europe. You had, you know, the empires of antiquity, such as the Roman Empire or the Persian Empire. You have the city-states of ancient Greece, or the city-states of medieval Italy, for example. So different forms of what we might call kind of states, but um, not the modern notion of the state. The modern notion of the Westphalian state, based on the sovereignty principle as we understand it today, has really only existed in Europe since 1648, and in the rest of the world even more recently than that. So states, you know, we tend to think of states as a given. You know, we tend to not be able to even imagine a world without nation states. But actually, states are not the only possible form of social and political organisation. It is possible to imagine other other ways of organising the world. You know, so states are social organisations which have been constructed via political and social processes. And ultimately, if you come right down to it, and we'll talk more about this when we talk about constructivism, ultimately, if you come right down to it, the state is a social construct. It's an idea. You know, the state only exists really because we all believe that it does. We all accept that, you know, there is this thing called the state and that the state has authority. Well, that is only true so long as we all accept it and we all believe it. If you really come right down to it, the state is an idea. The state is a social construct. So, the world is made up of sovereign states, and this brings us on to the concept of anarchy. So, this is an important concept in IR, and it is the starting point for a number of IR theoretical paradigms. Students often misunderstand what is meant by the term anarchy in international relations. Some students think that it means chaos and disorder. That's not exactly what it means. We're not talking about chaos. And also, there is no connection between the concept of anarchy, as we use it in IR, and anarchist politics. We're not talking about anarchism. We're not talking about the anarchist movement. Sometimes students get confused on that point as well. They hear the term anarchy and they think that we're talking about anarchist politics. Quite unrelated. The concept of anarchy, as used in IR, simply means that there is no authority above that of nation states. There is no sovereign over the sovereigns. There is no world government. Nation states are the highest authority that there is. Now you might think, well, hang on a minute, what about the United Nations, for example? Well, the United Nations is not in itself a sovereign entity. It's not a world government or anything of the sort. The United Nations is an organisation made up of member states, and whatever authority it might possess comes from the mutual agreement of its members. It's not sovereign in its own right. It doesn't have some kind of authority above the authority of its members. Instead, it exists to facilitate agreement between member states. And a similar thing with international law. Yes, international law exists, but international law only exists because of mutual recognition by sovereign states. There is no higher entity, there is no world legislature making international law. International law is created through agreement by sovereign states. There are various different sources of international law. The obvious one being treaties, which are explicitly signed and ratified by states. There are also generally accepted norms and principles of law, which are seen as kind of accepted more or less universally. There are various different sources of international law, but suffice to say that international law exists because of mutual recognition by sovereign states. Now, I know we've not talked much about international relations theory yet. Again, we'll be coming onto that in a later video. But suffice to say that a number of theoretical paradigms on international relations take anarchy as their starting point, i.e. they start from the assumption that we live in a world of sovereign nation states with no authority above them. What these different paradigms don't necessarily agree on is the consequences of anarchy. Some perspectives, particularly the realist paradigm, work on the assumption that anarchy inevitably leads to conflict, that in the absence of any higher authority, states will necessarily compete for power, that they will confront one another, and that conflict will be the inevitable result of that. But other paradigms don't necessarily agree. So, for example, the liberal paradigm on international relations is coming from the perspective that despite anarchy, cooperation still occurs between states, and that it is possible to actually overcome anarchy and build international order through the creation of international law and international norms and international institutions. So that even though we don't have a world government, nonetheless we have an ordered system. Which of these views is correct? Well, I'll leave that to you to decide. But personally, I think reality is somewhere in between the two. In reality, there is evidence of both conflict and cooperation in the world system. So is there conflict? Yes, of course there is. You only have to turn on the news and we see conflict, unfortunately, around the world on an ongoing basis. But nonetheless, we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that there is also a great deal of cooperation and there is a great deal of order. So again, as we mentioned in the previous video, you can get on a plane and you can fly to another country and cross the airspace of a dozen or 24 countries, and you can feel safe doing that. You can feel reasonably safe that you're not going to get shot down, for example, and that you're going to safely arrive at your destination because there is a system of international air traffic control and there are agreements between states which allow international travel to happen smoothly. International trade, international communications, there is much evidence that we live in many respects in an ordered world, a world that works at the international level despite the fact that there is no world government per se. So yes, international law isn't always respected. Unfortunately, sometimes international law is broken. Sometimes the rules go out of the window. Sometimes there are wars. But I'd say that there is more peaceful interaction and more cooperation in the world most of the time than there is conflict.
states are not continually fighting each other most of the time, and we do live in a reasonably ordered world in spite of the fact that there is no world government. So while the realists do have a point, I think the liberals are onto something as well.
I'm going to touch briefly on the concept of security, because security has been one of the key issues, one of the key questions in international relations from the beginning. So I'm not going to go into great depth about this at this point, but I think it's a concept that needs to be mentioned, because many of the IR theories that we will be looking at deal, at least partially, with questions around security. So what do we mean by security? That is the question to which different theories might have different answers. But if we start off and take the dictionary definition of security, security is the state of being free from danger or threat. The absence of danger or threat equals security. But leading on from that, of course, two obvious questions arrive. Okay, whose security are we talking about? Who are we securing from danger or threat? And what sort of threat are we talking about? And in terms of answering these questions, again, the different paradigms may give you different answers.
So the traditional understanding of security has been what we might call the realist definition of security. The view of security as being primarily about national security. In other words, the security of the state. So the thing that we are protecting, the thing that we are making secure, is the state itself. And again, this kind of an assumption that this includes the security of the population as well, but ultimately the state, the survival and the protection of the state itself being the goal. And what sorts of threats might exist to a state? Well, again, from a traditional realist perspective, we're talking primarily threats from other states. We're talking military threats in particular, perhaps economic threats to some extent, but mainly military threats from other states. That's the traditional understanding of what security means. And again, perhaps some acceptance of non-state kind of quasi-military threats such as terrorism and so on, but the main focus on national defence, national security against mainly military threats from other states. However, in recent years or recent decades, there has been an increasing tendency within IR and within security studies, which is kind of a subfield of IR. There has been this increasing tendency towards reframing security, redefining security in different terms, in broader terms. And in particular, there has been an increased emphasis on human security, i.e. an understanding that the security of the population, the security of the people at both an individual and a group level is not necessarily the same thing as national security. And that the threat to the security of people, the security of individuals, may not be just military threat. Lots of other threats exist as well, which have always been recognised but have not necessarily been seen as coming under this heading of security. So if we look at, for example, an issue like poverty, an issue like starvation, for example, malnutrition. Obviously, this has been seen as a major issue for many years, but it wasn't kind of framed as coming under this heading of security. But if you think about it, if you're in a developing country and you are poor and you don't have enough to eat and you are in danger of starvation, then that is the biggest threat to your survival. You're not particularly worried about the state next door invading, rolling tanks over the border. I mean, you may be worried about that, but your more immediate concern is the fact that you don't have enough to eat. And if you don't if you don't get food, then potentially you're in danger of dying. So that is the biggest threat to your survival. In a similar vein, we can talk about water security, we can talk about health security. Of course, the recent COVID-19 pandemic has kind of brought this to the forefront of everyone's minds. We could be talking about rampant disease being the biggest threat to your survival, to your security. We can talk about other kinds of threats as well. We can even talk about things like gender security, for example. So the idea of human security is that, first of all, the referent object, i.e. the thing that we are trying to secure, doesn't necessarily have to be the state itself. You know, so the trend has been to shift the focus away from the security of the state towards the security of people. And again, this recognition that security means much more than just security from military threats. It means securing people from a much broader range of different types of threats. That's the idea of human security as opposed to national security.
Finally, for this section, let's talk about the concept of globalization. Globalization, of course, is another of the key phenomena in present-day global politics, which international relations theory attempts to explain and interpret. So yeah, although we use the term globalization quite a lot, it's not easy to pin it down to a simple, short definition. It's not that easy to define precisely what globalization is. But in broad terms, it refers to a process by which the world is becoming increasingly interconnected. Now, an important aspect of that, of course, is economic interdependence and economic globalization, a process by which the world economy is increasingly becoming a single planetary economy rather than a set of national economies with a certain amount of trade between them. Increasingly, it makes more sense to talk about a single global economy. So the economic dimensions of globalization are very important, but also the cultural and social dimensions of globalization as well. It refers to a process by which, in some respects, cultures are becoming the boundaries between cultures have been broken down, and different cultures, to some extent at least, are merging together to form a single planetary culture. Now, again, that doesn't mean that regional culture disappears altogether. I'm not saying that the world has become completely homogeneous. Far from it. But nonetheless, there are aspects of 21st century culture which can be recognised the world over. And again, I mean that can mean commercial brands, it can mean music, it can mean sport, it can mean a lot of different things. But increasingly, there's this notion of a shift towards a global society, the idea of the global village. So an increasingly interconnected global economy, to the extent that it makes more sense in many respects to talk about a single integrated global economy. All of this, of course, being enabled and facilitated by technological advancement, technological change. So particularly in areas like travel, for example, so the rise not just of jet aircraft, but the accessibility of jet travel,
the ability, which again is a relatively recent thing, just going back a few decades or so, the ability of the masses across much of the world to access relatively cheap air travel, which obviously makes movement, makes travel around the globe much easier and much more accessible to an extent that just didn't exist a few generations ago. But also particularly the rise of communications technology, advancements in communications technology, and particularly the rise of the internet in recent decades. In many respects, we can boil globalization down to the increased movement of people, of goods and services, of capital, of information and ideas across national boundaries. Increasingly, these things can flow freely at a global level, which again, 50 or 100 years ago was just not possible, or at least nothing like to the same extent. We're also talking about the interlinking of social relations and the dynamic of action from the local to the global. What does that mean? Well, basically it means that social and political movements have gone global in a way that just wasn't the case in the past. So, for example, if we think of environmental politics, if we think of a campaigner like Greta Thunberg, who is of course Swedish, but her name and her political campaign is well known across a large number of countries. Now, whether you agree with her politics or not is another matter, but the point is that her campaign is known worldwide, and is very much a global campaign. So in lots of issue areas, environmental politics being just one, campaigning has shifted from the national level to the global level. And of course cultural exchange as well. We've already mentioned the importance of cultural exchange. So people, for example, watching the same movies the world over, people the world over, for example, following the same sports. So a good example would be the FIFA World Cup, or it may be that you have an interest in a football team, you follow a football team which may be located in a different country, in a different part of the world, or the FIA Formula One World Championship, for example, or things like music or food is an excellent example. Again, I'm sure many of us like Indian food or Italian food or Chinese food, for example, and you can get these different types of food in most parts of the world. So again, we're talking about aspects of culture which may have originated in one part of the world, but which have since spread to other parts of the world and gone global, if you like. And sport and music and food are all good examples of that. Or to put it slightly differently, we can all imagine, and again, this is the norm nowadays. We think nothing of this sort of scenario. You're sitting there in your living room in the UK, you might be watching an American movie while eating Indian food and messaging your friend in Australia on a device made in China. And again, you think nothing of that. That is just the norm these days. But when you actually, pause and think about this, this is, really all of these things are relatively recent developments. So it's important for us as IR scholars to think about and consider the extent to which globalization has changed the nature of international politics. And again, although we've not got onto theory yet, but you'll find when we do start to look at theory that different theoretical paradigms will view this quite differently. So to a realist, for example, realists would argue that globalization hasn't really changed the fundamental nature of the world system. because realists, as we will see when we talk in more detail about realist theory, realists see the world as being made up of Westphalian nation states which are in competition with one another, and the kind of power politics between states as being the fundamental nature of the global system. Realists argue that globalization hasn't really changed that at all. But other perspectives would disagree. So liberals, for example, would see globalization and interdependence, particularly economic interdependence, as making a substantial difference to the nature of world politics and facilitating and encouraging a greater degree of cooperation and the development of international institutions, which make quite a fundamental difference from a liberal perspective to the nature of global politics. A Marxist would also see globalization as politics, although Marxists would view globalization slightly differently. A Marxist would see globalization as being essentially the expansion of capitalism. So yeah, the different theoretical paradigms on IR are going to view globalization differently. But whichever theoretical paradigm you subscribe to, it's important to consider the phenomenon of globalization and think about how and to what extent it has altered the nature of international politics. And it's one of the, it really is one of the fundamental questions that we need to explore in IR, is the extent to which present day global politics has moved beyond traditional interstate international relations. Has globalization caused a fundamental change away from traditional interstate politics? Maybe it has, maybe not. Again, that's a question that we can debate, but it's certainly an important question to consider. So that concludes this second video. We've covered quite a few concepts and issues there, so if you have any questions or any comments that you would like to raise, then please feel free to add those in the comments section below. As ever, thanks for watching, and if you like my content, then please subscribe to my channel. Thanks very much, and I'll see you on the next video.